Do we already live in the Matrix? What if everything we have grown accustomed to calling reality has long been nothing more than a copy without an original? The film The Matrix, 1999, begins precisely with this question. In the very first scene, we see on Neo's shelf Jean Baudrillard's book Simulacra and Simulation. This is not merely a cinematic gesture, it is a sign. The film itself, its entire philosophy of a world of illusion, is born from the ideas of the French thinker. Baudrillard was one of the most radical philosophers of the second half of the 20th century. He argued that modernity is not merely a space of images and representations, but a world in which the boundary between reality and image has disappeared. His formula sounds almost like a sentence. We live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning. Simulacres et simulation. This line was written in the age of television and mass advertising. But today, in the digital era of social networks and artificial intelligence, it sounds prophetic. To grasp the sharpness of this thesis, it is useful to recall another cultural image, Jorge Luis Borges' tale on exactitude in science. In it, the map becomes so detailed that it coincides completely with the territory. And then the territory itself disappears. Only the map remains. In Baudrillard, this metaphor becomes a philosophical principle. The sign ceases to refer to reality and begins to replace it. It is important to emphasize, Baudrillard was neither a philosopher of cinema nor merely a cultural critic. His path began with the analysis of everyday life and objects. In the system of objects and the consumer society, he showed that advertising and fashion produce not so much goods as signs. And it is through this everyday analysis that he arrives at the radical idea of hyperreality. At the beginning of the 1980s, when he writes Simulacra and Simulation, he poses a question that today seems central. Is the distinction between reality and its model possible at all? Or do we live in a world where the original has become redundant and models and images have long gone ahead of us? This channel is only 3 months old, and I try to approach each script with the utmost care. That is why your comments, subscriptions, and likes are not a mere formality, but genuine support and motivation. They are what allow me to keep working on these videos and to grow the channel. In the near future, I even plan to switch to my own voiceover, so your participation is especially important to me. Jean Baudrillard was a French philosopher and sociologist, often called the most provocative thinker of the late 20th century. He entered intellectual history not only as the author of radical ideas, but also as someone capable of diagnosing his own age. An age of television, mass advertising, and the first wars we witnessed not on the battlefield, but on the screen. His philosophical path began in the 1960s, a time when France was shaken by student uprisings and cultural revolution. He taught at the University of Nanterre, the very place from which, in 1968, the student revolt erupted, reshaping the entire intellectual climate of Europe. The atmosphere of the shock of modernity, the clash between the ideals of freedom and the reality of consumer society became the backdrop for his first books. Baudrillard started out as a critic of everyday objects. In the system of objects and the consumer society, he showed that advertising and fashion produce not so much goods as signs. We buy not functional objects, but symbols, codes of status, success, and taste. Already here emerges his key insight. In modern society, Value is determined not by practical function, but by symbolic code. To see this insight in a cultural mirror, one need only recall the works of Andy Warhol. His famous Campbell's soup cans, or portraits of Marilyn Monroe, are not simply paintings of food or of an actress. They are demonstrations that the very repeatability of an image becomes a value in itself. Warhol, with his brush, seems to say what Baudrillard formulates philosophically. Uniqueness disappears, while seriality and the sign become the new aura. Here, one can also recall Walter Benjamin and his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. If Benjamin spoke of the loss of the aura, Baudrillard spoke of the loss of the original itself. I myself love art deeply and often reflect on how it resonates with philosophy. If such references interest you, let me know in the comments. I can include them more often, or even record a separate video on art and philosophy. Gradually, his thought moved further, from a Marxist critique of consumption to semiotics and post-structuralism. And here it is crucial to understand. Baudrillard thinks not so much as a sociologist, but as a radical philosopher of the sign. For him, the symbolic is not a superstructure above reality, but the very foundation of the social fabric. From this emerge his most famous provocations. In 1991, during the Gulf War, he wrote, "The Gulf War did not take place." This was not a denial of bombings and deaths. His thesis was something else. The war as we knew it existed only as a television spectacle. The real battle was displaced by the image, transformed into a media simulation. Thus, Baudrillard arrives at his central intuition. Modernity cannot be thought apart from the fact that media and signs do not merely reflect reality. They create it, replacing the very fabric of the world with their own models. When Baudrillard says simulacrum, he does not mean a mere copy, nor a fake. A simulacrum is a sign that no longer corresponds to reality, because it has lost its original referent. It does not reflect reality. It produces it, an effect generated by codes, standards, and algorithms. From here arises his idea of hyperreality, a space in which the difference between the imaginary and the real becomes impossible. Because what is primary is no longer things, but models. The four phases of the image, how the relation to reality changes. To clarify this thought, Baudrillard proposes an optic for reading images. He distinguishes four regimes. The image reflects reality, like a mirror. This is the classical era of representation. The image masks and distorts reality, like an ideological filter. The image masks the absence of reality. It pretends that a referent is still there. The image bears no relation to any reality. It is a pure simulacrum, self-sufficient, creating an effect of reality without any original. Here, Borges's parable of the map and the territory readily comes to mind. The map becomes so detailed that it absorbs the territory itself. For Baudrillard, this is not a metaphor, but a principle. The map, the model, comes to exist in place of the land. The three orders of simulacra, from counterfeit to code. Baudrillard deepens this logic by distinguishing three historically significant orders. First order, counterfeit, the classical era. The key is the original. We can tell a genuine gold doubloon from a fake, an original Rembrandt from a copy. Second order, production, modernity. The key is the series. Machine reproducibility destroys uniqueness. Value is determined by the standard. A coin is authentic if it conforms to the die, not to provenance. Third order, simulation, late modernity, postmodernity. The key is the CODE. The model precedes experience and sets what we will take to be real. This is the procession of simulacra. The model precedes the event, and the event becomes merely its realization. Here, the real ceases to be the source. It becomes a derivative of the model. In the contemporary world, the map not only replaces the territory, it dictates what territory can exist. Imagine Google Maps. At times, you drive by the map. While on the ground the road does not yet exist, it is still being built, and yet you have already set off. The model outpaces the territory. This is the procession of simulacra. What disappears? It is crucial to grasp. For Baudrillard, it is not things that disappear, but differences between the real and the image, between the original and the copy, between truth and falsehood. When the referent dissolves, truth no longer means correspondence to fact. It becomes a question of compatibility with the system. True is what functions within the code. And here is a question for you. If tomorrow your entire life were recorded as a Netflix series, would you live differently? Or would you live the same way, only now, aware that you are being filmed? How to spot the simulacrum in everyday life. Financial derivatives. Price depends not on the commodity, but on risk models. The market reacts to the forecast, not to the thing social media. We believe we choose what to watch. In reality, we desire precisely what is rendered visible by the algorithm. The algorithm creates an operational double of our desire. Generative media, AI. There is no original here. Text or image is primary as a function of the model, not as a reflection of a real author, the raw aesthetic. No filters, live sound, accidental slip. These two are styles, codes, that produce an effect of authenticity. And in each case, the sign no longer conceals reality. It renders the very question of reality superfluous, replacing it with the question, is this admissible within the system? If you would like to look more deeply at how different philosophers pose the question of signs and meaning in their own ways, watch my video on Derrida. There we analyze deconstruction and the very idea of truth. And it complements Baudrillard beautifully. Misreadings of Baudrillard. This is not about fakes. A fake presupposes a standard of truth. For Baudrillard, the standard has vanished. This is not about manipulation. Manipulation is possible if there is an outside to discourse. In simulation, there is no longer an outside. And this is not mere cultural critique. Baudrillard speaks of the ontology of the sign, of how things exist at all when the code is primary. A mini toolkit to read the world through Baudrillard's lens. Ask yourself, where is the model here? Protocol, ranking, algorithm. What counts as real within this system? Where has the test of correspondence vanished? What value or desire does this code produce? This is philosophical practice, not to unmask lies, but to perceive the mechanisms that produce the effect of truth. When models begin to outpace experience, and experience is reorganized around models through ratings, KPIs, algorithmic feeds, we find ourselves in hyperreality, a world in which the real is not given to us as an external datum, but is produced as a stable effect of the reproduction of signs. And here lies Baudrillard's key turn. The philosopher's task is not to expose falsehood. That still belongs to the second order. The task is to learn to read the mechanisms that produce the very effect of reality. If you enjoy such deep analyses, subscribe to the channel. I have many more videos ahead where we will work through philosophy step by step together. At first glance, Disneyland is nothing more than an amusement park, a children's land of fantasy. a place for family leisure. But for Baudrillard, it is not an innocent fairy tale, but an algorithm of hyperreality. In its purest form, its task is not to provide illusion, but to preserve our belief, since there is evident fiction here. Then somewhere outside, reality must still remain. Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America, which is Disneyland. If we look at Disneyland naively, we readily agree, yes, everything here is not real. Plastic castles, animatronics, people in cartoon costumes. But this very obvious artificiality is the trick. It works as an alibi. Since we see fiction here, then beyond the park, authentic reality awaits us. The philosophical conclusion is more radical. It is precisely outside the park that everything already functions by the same principle, as a network of attractions, brands, and images. Disneyland is needed to mask the disappearance of the difference between the real and the imaginary everywhere. How it works today: social media as the new Disneyland, TikTok, Instagram Reels, Snapchat filters. Their artificiality is obvious, but this conspicuous stylization is necessary so that we believe real life exists somewhere off-screen. In reality, life outside the screen increasingly conforms to platform logic, clothing style, speech, gestures, all shaped with an eye to likability. Reality shows. They are presented as pure life, unfiltered. But it is precisely the carefully scripted scenarios, editing, and casting that make them more constructed than cinema. The island of reality TV is Disneyland. It creates the appearance of an exception that conceals the fact that staging is already everywhere. Themed urban spaces, shopping malls with Moroccan food courts, old streets in new districts, Parisian boulevards in Las Vegas. We know these are stylizations, and it is precisely this awareness that allows us to think outside. There are genuine streets, yet the real city has long since become a construct of tourism, branding, and marketing. Here, one can recall the series Westworld, an amusement park where fiction exists only to hide that everything else is also a park, just larger and more complex. Disneyland is a model of society in which illusion is made explicit in order to mask the disappearance of reality everywhere. The paradox is that the system admits its fictitiousness in order to sustain belief in authenticity outside its bounds. In Baudrillard's terms, Disneyland is a simulacrum of the second order. It displays the unreal, but its function is to sustain the simulacrum of the third order, hyperreality, where outside there is no longer any original. A question: when was the last time you told yourself, well, this is definitely artificial, and felt relieved that somewhere else, authenticity must still exist? Baudrillard would say, this is precisely the mechanism of Disneyland, embedded in our perception. And if you have your own examples of modern Disneylands, share them in the comments. It would be great to discuss. And of course, don't forget to like the video to support the channel. Today, we live precisely in the hyperreality that Jean Baudrillard described back in the 1980s. His thoughts have ceased to be abstract theory. They have become our everyday experience. Social media, the I as the avatar of the algorithm. Photographs and stories no longer reflect life. They set its format. We eat in ways that will make food photogenic. We travel for the shot. We even form friendships with an eye toward likability. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The simulacrum is true. Filters and masks do not distort reality. They create it. Authenticity on Instagram is not access to the real, but a new style, a new code of recognizability. Here, Baudrillard unexpectedly converges with Michel Foucault. Just as disciplinary power shaped the body and habits, algorithmic power shapes our self-perception. The network creates an operational double of the subject, a digital version, that the algorithm knows better than we know ourselves. And it is this double that begins to govern our desires. By the way, I have a separate video on Foucault. In his thought, power too shapes us from within. And I explain this in detail in my video on discipline and control. If you haven't seen it, I recommend going back to it. It provides a helpful shared ground for understanding Baudrillard. Advertising and brands, empty slogans as codes of identity. Nike does not sell sneakers, and Apple does not sell phones. They sell myths of identity. Just do it. But do what exactly? The slogan works precisely because it is empty. It points to no specific action. It opens a space in which we ourselves must inscribe our ID. This is simulacrum, a sign that does not conceal meaning, but produces emptiness as value. Here it is worth recalling Guy Debord. In The Society of the Spectacle, he wrote, "Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation." Baudrillard goes further. Now, representation does not merely replace experience, it becomes reality itself. Artificial intelligence, the end of authorship? Today, neural networks write texts, paint pictures, generate voices. The question, who is the author, has lost its meaning. Text no longer expresses a subject. It becomes a network product, a copy, that refers to no original. For Baudrillard, this is called the procession of simulacra. The model always precedes reality rather than following it. AI no longer copies the style of a writer. It creates style where there never was an original. This is not counterfeit. This is primary production. Here, a parallel with Jacques Derrida arises. He wrote of the death of the author, of how meaning is always deferred and never coincides with its source. Baudrillard goes further. In the age of simulation, the figure of the author is simply no longer needed by the system of signs. The future. Hyperreality as norm. Imagine a world where all content in social media is generated by AI and real users are no longer necessary. Imagine virtual influencers with millions of followers who never existed, or a conversation with a digital double where you cannot tell whether it is a person or a program. This is not a scenario from Black Mirror. It is already our present. We live in the prologue to hyperreality, where the boundary between the real and the simulated has ceased to exist. Social media, brands, artificial intelligence, all of these are not distortions of reality, but new conditions of its existence. Real is that which is permitted to circulate, that which can be liked, reposted, indexed. Here, Baudrillard sounds uncannily contemporary. With Foucault, he shares the thought. That power shapes the subject, only today. This power is the power of code. With Derrida, he shares suspicion toward the original, but he goes further. The original no longer exists. There is only simulation. And the crucial question that remains, if reality is increasingly defined by algorithms, does there exist any outside of the system, where we could truly be ourselves? Or do we already live in hyperreality, where both the I and the real are nothing but effects? Of code? By the way, it is precisely these topics, AI, authorship, the philosophy of technology, that I plan to develop further on this channel. If that interests you too, hit the notification bell so you won't miss new videos. Today, authenticity has become almost the chief demand of culture. Raw aesthetics, no filters, confessions of vulnerability, storytelling as it is, all of this is sold as the promise of the real. But Baudrillard warns, it is precisely this authenticity that is one of the most sophisticated simulacra of the third order. A sign that does not grant access to reality, but produces its effect. A short genealogy from sincerity to authenticity. The distinction has long been registered in the intellectual tradition. Lionel Trilling opposed sincerity, the alignment of behavior with conviction, to authenticity, faithfulness to oneself, even against norms. Charles Taylor spoke of authenticity as a moral ideal, living according to oneself, but not in a vacuum, rather within a horizon of shared meanings. For Heidegger, Eigentlichkeit was not psychological naturalness, but existential resolve to take on one's own possibility. And in Walter Benjamin's essay on mechanical reproduction, another line appears, the disappearance of the aura of the unique work. This shift becomes a prefiguration of Baudrillard's thought. Not only aura disappears, the original itself vanishes. For Baudrillard, authenticity in the age of simulation is no longer an experience of the unmodeled, but a set of markers. It is recognized as code, not lived, as event, how authenticity becomes a code. Consider raw aesthetics, shaky cameras, no makeup, slips of the tongue, accidental pauses. We know this language, and we read it as the sign of closeness. But precisely because it is a recognizable style, it works as code. We do not believe in the authenticity of the moment. We believe in the marker of authenticity we see. For Baudrillard, this is the logic of simulation, from the image that masks reality, to the image that masks its absence, and finally, to the image that has no relation to reality whatsoever. Mechanisms of capitalizing authenticity. This authenticity has become a commodity. Experience economy. Stories of farm families, local legends, handwritten fonts on packaging. We purchase not the product, but the promise of its origin, algorithmic verification, live stream, geotag, no editing. Authenticity is validated by metrics, viewer counts, watch time, storytelling of vulnerability, confessions of burnout, or trauma turn into a content genre. Sincerity ceases to be a personal risk and becomes a production practice, community as a service. We have a real community, but its realness is measured by retention and DAU, authenticity, validated by KPIS. Cases, the anatomy of the authentic code. Farmer's bread, baked in the center of a metropolis, but packaged in the style of old rural tradition. A live stream, positioned as living presence, yet carefully structuring the roles of viewers. A screenshot from notes, where a celebrity or brand issues sincere apologies. The recognizability of the genre turns it into an empty ritual. Tape hiss in music, once an artifact of the real medium, now embedded in digital plugins. All these examples show authenticity has become a recognizable and reproducible style, which means it already functions as code, philosophical dialogue. Taylor would remind us the ideal of authenticity is not reducible to marketing. It is the moral demand to live meaningfully. Adorno and Horkheimer would add, the culture industry swallows even distinctions, turning authenticity into a format. Byung-Chul Han would note transparency and constant self-exposure lead not to truth, but to control and burnout. Zizek would smirk. We know very well that it's a game, but we play on. Together, this yields a difficult conclusion. Authenticity carries an ethical intuition, but under platform conditions, it is almost inevitably absorbed by code. Is there an authenticity not reduced to simulacrum? For Baudrillard, a faint hope remains in symbolic exchange, where a gesture escapes equivalence and calculation, gift, risk, event. Criteria may be sketched: irreversibility, that which cannot be reshot better; non-archivability, that which loses sense outside the moment; incompatibility with metrics, risk of the subject. But even such events are quickly transformed into formats of radicality. It may be more honest to admit, authenticity is possible only as a fleeting crack, and almost immediately. It is absorbed by style. Notice markers, grainy footage, tears on camera, trembling hands. This is code. Look for reproducibility. If the effect is easy to repeat, it belongs to the model. Recall metrics. Live and sincere are verified by view counts. Compare cost. The less risk for the subject, the more likely it is. Stylized sincerity. The cult of authenticity is needed by the system for the same reason as Disneyland. It preserves belief, since there is the real here. Then, somewhere outside the codes, reality must still exist. But the logic of simulation is such that this very belief sustains hyperreality, concealing its totality. Baudrillard never offered moralistic recipes. He has no revolution, as in Marx, nor practices of resistance to power, as in Foucault. His gesture was different, not an escape from the system, but an exposure of its mechanics. We must learn to read signs as we read texts, to see not only what they show, but also what they conceal. Philosophy as a practice of attention. For Baudrillard, philosophy is not a theory on paper, but an art of attention to hyperreality. We live in a world where the referent has disappeared, where authenticity has become code, and where the algorithm knows us better than we know ourselves. To exit this logic is impossible, but we can learn to read its moves, as a musician hears chords in noise. Mini exercises in philosophical vision in the news. Don't just ask, what is this about? Ask, what roles and emotions is this image imposing on me? In social media, not, do I like this post? But why is it made likable? What habits is it forming? In advertising, not, should I buy this? But what code of identity am I acquiring with it? In formats of authenticity, not, is this sincere? But what markers of authenticity am I recognizing? And why do I trust them? In your own experience, ask, where do I live for the event itself? And where for its image? These small shifts are philosophy as practice, reading, not unmasking. Other voices, expanding the horizon. Foucault would say such exercises help us see how power passes through us, shaping bodies and gestures. Derrida would add, any reading differs meaning. The task is not to find truth, but to sustain the play of differences. Zizek would smirk, we know we live in simulation, and it is precisely this knowledge that keeps us in the game. The future as mirror. Imagine an episode of Black Mirror. The news is hosted by artificial intelligence, and viewers react with emojis in real time. What here is real? The faces? Algorithm. The emotions? Codified through reactions. The event? More interface of participation than fact. Baudrillard's philosophical gesture is not to say this is bad, but to help us. See, we participate not in an event, but in the circulation of signs. The viewer's task today is not to find the authentic, but to learn to read hyperreality. Where everything seems obvious, look for codes. Where authenticity is promised, recognize style. Where you are told to just be yourself, remember that too is a script of the sign system. And ask yourself, what looks real to me today? And am I sure it is not just another copy without an original? Baudrillard shows the system does not hide reality from us. It hides its disappearance. This is not a conspiracy, not manipulation by someone. It is the very logic of modernity. Models and codes create the field of possible experience so that the question, where is the real, becomes obsolete. Truth ceases to correspond to a referent. It is measured by compatibility with the code. If it works, it is true. In this world, the real is not lost, it is produced. Baudrillard does not call us to return to the authentic. That path is closed. But he offers another practice, to read signs, as carefully as we read texts, to see where authenticity is only style, a code of recognition, to understand that reality itself is a script in which we are included. Here, philosophy is not a search for lost truth, but training of vision and attentiveness to the mechanisms of simulation. Why this matters today, in the age of deepfakes, metaverses, and artificial influencers. The question of the simulacrum is no longer academic, it is political, because power is constructed through code. It is ethical, because identity is formed by algorithms. It is psychological, because our self becomes a function of the digital model. And here, Baudrillard unexpectedly joins others, with Foucault, who spoke of power coursing through the body, with Derrida, for whom writing always deferred meaning, with Zizek, reminding us we know the game, but keep playing, with Byung-Chul Han, for whom transparency and self-exposure lead to control and burnout. Each, from different angles, tells us the same: modernity shapes us from within. Jean Baudrillard showed we do not merely live among images, we dwell inside hyperreality, where the very question, what is real, becomes a trap. But precisely for this reason, philosophy is needed more than ever today, not as the search for lost truth, but as the skill of seeing the game. If you enjoyed this reflection on Baudrillard, share the video with friends. You'll help the channel grow and show that philosophy is as necessary now as ever. And now, a question for you. What seems real to you today? And are you sure it is not just another copy without an original? Write in the comments. Subscribe if you'd like to continue this journey together. And see you in the next video, where we'll move further. From Derrida and Baudrillard to the philosophy of the 21st century.